What would you do if the people sworn to protect your country saw you as a threat just because of the color of your skin? On an ordinary morning in Arlington, Virginia, two officers handcuffed a woman they thought was just another suspicious civilian, but they had no idea. She was Brigadier General Alana Reed, one of the highest-ranking military officers in the country. What happened next would shake the Pentagon, spark a national reckoning, and expose a system hating decades of injustice. This is not just a story about race power or policing. It's a story about what happens when the wrong woman is silenced and then refuses to stay quiet. You're about to witness a confrontation that rewrote the rules of accountability. One voice, one call, one revolution. And it all started with a pair of handcuffs. Under the golden haze of an Arlington morning, the streets around Fort Myer were unusually quiet, save for the soft hiss of early traffic and the distant clatter of a metro bus making its regular rounds. It was the kind of silence that draped itself in calm but could snap in an instant, a silence that Brigadier General Alana Reed, fresh off a transatlantic flight and still dressed in understated civilian attire, knew all too well from years on foreign soil. She had faced IEDs in Kandahar, insurgent traps in Fallujah, and the chill of diplomatic negotiations in Eastern Europe. But nothing quite prepared her for the piercing snap of handcuffs on American soil, not from enemies overseas, but from those sworn to protect her at home. She had stopped briefly at a small local cafe tucked beneath a red brick office building, her government-issued black Mercedes-Benz sedan, parked legally at the curb. She wanted nothing more than a moment's peace, a latte, to offset the fog of travel and the chance to rehearse her debrief mentally before stepping into a closed-door Pentagon meeting regarding classified cyber defense algorithms she'd helped develop. But as she stepped from the vehicle, her ID badge stashed away in a leather folder in her bag, her posture crisp and calm, despite the fatigue, two police officers stationed across the street leaned forward in their cruiser, exchanging a look that wasn't about protocol. It was about profiling Officer Mitchell, a man in his early 40s with mirrored sunglasses and a jawline that telegraphed arrogance, muttered to his younger partner, Officer Daly. Suspicious car tinted windows, D, C plates. Doesn't fit this neighborhood? Daly glanced at Alana, his eyes narrowing as if the sight of a black woman emerging from a high-end vehicle constituted probable cause. They watched as she walked inside, her stride unhurried, her back straight, like every fiber of her being had been trained for precision and poise. They waited only minutes before pulling up behind her vehicle and radioing in a vague possible narcotics activity, their tone nonchalant as if planting a justification was just part of the job. When Alana exited with a coffee in hand, she noticed the cruiser idling near her car. She didn't flinch, she didn't run. She simply approached the door, prepared to continue her morning. That's when Mitchell stepped out. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle," he barked, hand already hovering near his holster. "Why?" Alana asked, setting her cup gently on the roof. "Am I being detained? You fit a description?" Mitchell shot back. "We've had reports of car thefts involving women matching your build in the area." Daly circled behind her like a vulture. "Ma'am, place your hands where I can see them." The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so real. "I'm a government official," Alana replied, calmly, trying not to escalate. "I can show you my identification." But her words, measured and diplomatic, only seemed to provoke them. "You're not in charge here," Mitchell sneered. "Step back, or we'll have to detain you for non-compliance." Before she could fully respond, Daly grabbed her wrist and yanked it behind her, triggering muscle memory from combat training she refused to act on. The cuffs snapped shut loud, and final, the bite of cold metal slicing through her composed exterior like a breach in enemy lines, bystanders froze. A few reached for their phones. Alana Reed, a woman who had once briefed two presidents, was shoved face first against the hood of a patrol car, like she was nothing more than a statistic. The uniform she wasn't wearing did not shield her. Her skin did not grant her grace. "You have no idea who I am," she said, her voice as cold and precise as a sniper's breath before the shot. "But in 20 minutes you will regret this moment for the rest of your careers." Mitchell laughed. "Lady, you think name-dropping's gonna help you?" Alana ignored him and turned slightly to a young woman standing nearby, her hands trembling as she recorded. "I need you to dial a number for me," Alana said, reciting a string of digits in a code, an emergency protocol known only to a handful of Pentagon clearance holders. Tell them General Reed has been detained unlawfully by Officers Mitchell and Daly in Arlington." The woman's fingers hesitated, then typed, "She pressed call. 2 rings, then Pentagon Secure Command, state your clearance." The woman stuttered through the code Alana had given her. Silence. Then stand by. At that moment, something shifted. Daly's radio crackled violently. "Unit 134, stand down. I repeat, stand down immediately." The dispatcher's voice was no longer calm. It was urgent. Mitchell's smugness faltered as a second voice overrode the channel. "This is Chief Warden. You have illegally detained a high-ranking Department of Defense officer. Cease contact and await federal response." Daly took a step back, the blood draining from his face. Alana stood motionless as her cuffs were unlocked. "We didn't know," Mitchell stammered. "You didn't ask." Alana cut in her tone, glacial. She took back the phone and with a single swipe was connected directly to Secretary Anderson at the Pentagon. "I want a full audit on both badge numbers, complaint histories, body cam footage, everything sent to the DOJ within the hour." She turned to the crowd, now gathered in stunned silence. "What happened here is not new," she said, her voice carrying. "But what happens next? That's the part that's changing." She walked to her vehicle with the same dignity she'd carried through every battlefield. And as the morning news cycle broke less than an hour later, showing still images of Mitchell and Daly, standing beside their cruiser heads down, removed from duty, the nation saw what Arlington's quiet street had witnessed firsthand, that no amount of bias could suppress truth when spoken with clarity, courage, and command. General Alana Reed wasn't just reclaiming her rights, she was rewriting the rules. Alana Reed sat behind the wheel of her sedan, her hands resting calmly on the leather steering wheel, though her pulse still carried the thud of adrenaline, not from fear, but from the cold, calculated clarity of someone who had just witnessed a familiar war fought in a different uniform. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, stared through the windshield, not at the crowd that still hovered around the scene, but past them, past the buildings, the traffic, the layers of history and contradiction baked into every inch of American concrete. She had endured sniper fire in Syria, slept under armored Humvees in the Afghan desert, and survived the politics of Washington, D.C. But this routine stop, this humiliating insult by men with guns and ignorance instead of orders and intelligence, it dug deeper than any battlefield wound. She turned the ignition key slowly, letting the quiet hum of the engine settle her breathing, before she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a slim black folder marked with the insignia of the Department of Defense. Inside was a sealed document containing the full classified agenda of her morning briefing, which, had she not been delayed, would have started exactly 12 minutes ago, in a situation room 2 floors below the Pentagon's East Wing. She wasn't just late, she was delayed by an act that, if recorded correctly, could unravel an entire chain of systemic misconduct, and she planned to use it. As she pulled out into traffic, the police cruiser behind her had already been ordered to remain stationary by internal affairs. The younger officer Daly had not said a word since unfastening her cuffs, his eyes darting back and forth like a child who had touched fire for the first time. Mitchell, on the other hand, had tried to mumble something about protocol misunderstanding and just doing his job, but Alana had stared through him like steel, her silence more punishing than any disciplinary report. She didn't believe in revenge, she believed in accountability. As she crossed the bridge into D.C., her phone lit up with encrypted text messages from the Pentagon's internal alert system. "Secretary Anderson's situation acknowledged. Your report will be escalated directly to the Inspector General's office. Legal is preparing immediate action." A second message arrived seconds later. "Civilian footage from the incident is already trending. Network interest confirmed. We advise discretion," Alana scoffed. Discretion. She had worn the shroud of discretion her entire life. Discreet when cadets underestimated her. Discreet when senior officers questioned her intelligence. Discreet when foreign generals stared too long at her skin and too little at her strategy charts. But today something had broken, not in her, but in the illusion that respect could be earned silently. Today her silence had been used against her. Her calm had been mistaken for submission. And that miscalculation was about to cost 2 officers and perhaps an entire department more than they could fathom. She arrived at the Pentagon's secure entrance and lowered her window. The guard snapped to attention, eyes widening as he recognized her. "Ma'am, I?" At ease, she said sharply, scanning her ID through the security glass. I'm already behind schedule. As the gates parted, she drove inside the familiar rigidity of military protocol, instantly washing over the air like antiseptic. Inside the building, conversation slowed as she walked through the corridors, civilian staffers whispering to one another, some already having seen the footage online. She ignored them all. When she entered the briefing room, a few of her fellow officers rose instinctively startled by her presence. Secretary Anderson himself stood, his face pale but focused. "General Reed," he said, motioning her toward the head of the table. "We received preliminary footage. We're moving fast, not fast enough," she replied, setting the folder down with a decisive thud. "I want a full audit of Arlington PD's last 12 months of stops, broken down by race, gender, and location. And I want a direct line between the Office of Military Justice and Civil Rights Enforcement. No more interagency delays." The room fell quiet. A younger analyst leaned forward. "Ma'am, we're still waiting on verification for some of the officers' past records." "Then verify them," she snapped. "Today." Her tone cut through the room like a command at the front lines. She had no time for cowardice masked as bureaucracy. Every recorded interaction they've had in the last year, every complaint that's been buried, every citizen they've tried to erase. I want names, I want patterns. One of the legal advisors looked up, hesitating. "Ma'am, are we pursuing criminal charges or civil sanctions?" Alana paused for just a breath. "Both," as the meeting continued. Maps lit up on the wall, data streams pouring in, live heat maps showing racial disparities in traffic stops across Northern Virginia, complaints that matched the officers' badge numbers, and at least 3 incidents previously dismissed by their commanding officer, now reclassified for urgent review. Alana didn't flinch as the evidence mounted. She had known it. She had seen it in their eyes before they even touched her. That wasn't training, that wasn't a mistake. That was targeted, and it was going to end. Hours later, as she left the Pentagon, her mind no longer on cyber threats or national security, but on something far more insidious: domestic injustice. Her phone buzzed again. CNN special report: Black female general detained by police sparks. National debate. DOJ confirms federal inquiry into Arlington PD. Another message followed. Mayor requests private meeting, Civil Rights Coalition, offering joint statement. She was a soldier, yes, but this war, this battlefield of perception, prejudice, and power misused on American soil, she was more than ready for it. And as she looked out across the Potomac, the sun beginning to dip below the skyline, casting amber light across the river's edge, she knew tomorrow wouldn't just be another day. It would be a reckoning, not just for Mitchell and Daley, not just for Arlington PD, but for every agency, every officer, every institution that believed a woman like her could be silenced, diminished, or erased. Not today, not anymore. Brigadier General Alana Reed wasn't done. She had just begun. That evening, as the eastern seaboard was slowly swallowed by dusk and city skylines blurred into constellations of amber and steel, Brigadier General Alana Reed sat alone in the study of her Georgetown brownstone. The television muted her gaze, fixed on the flickering headline that danced across the screen like a slow drumbeat of consequence: Pentagon general wrongfully detained. Federal probe launched. Her military-issued laptop glowed with encrypted memos, legal briefings, and dozens of newly unsealed internal complaints from Arlington PD. Each one like a match dropped into dry timber, waiting to ignite public outrage. But beneath her calm exterior, a quieter storm brewed, not of vengeance, but of responsibility. Because Alana knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It hadn't been the moment those cuffs closed around her wrists. It had become something else, something national, something systemic. And she, whether she had wanted it or not, had become the face of it. Her phone chimed with a secure call from Secretary Anderson. She didn't hesitate. "General," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we've just received pressure from the governor's office. He's requesting we handle this quietly. Internal reprimands, no media fallout." Alana didn't raise her voice, didn't shift in her chair, but her reply cracked through the line like a bullet. "Then the governor should be more worried about what kind of officers his state is hiring." Anderson exhaled. "I figured you'd say that. I'm not here to protect the comfort of politicians," she replied. I'm here to protect justice, even if it means making enemies in every precinct between here and the Mississippi. There's more, he added, hesitating. The DOJ reached out. They want you to testify at a federal hearing next Tuesday. Alana's fingers tightened around the armrest. Of course they do. Are you willing? He asked. And that question in all its simplicity unwrapped 1,000 wounds she had hidden beneath epaulets and medals. Was she willing? Was she willing to stand again in front of cameras, in front of skeptical congressmen, in front of a nation that had cheered her victories on foreign soil, but hesitated to defend her when her skin color made her a target in her own backyard? The answer came not from pride, but from pain. Yes, she said softly. I'm willing. After the call ended, Alana stood and walked to the old military chest at the corner of her study, where memories she rarely unpacked lay folded in cloth and silence. She opened it slowly, pulling out her first field uniform, the one stained with sand from the Kunar Valley, the one she'd worn when she received her battlefield promotion after extracting a wounded squad under fire. As she held the fabric, her mind drifted to her cadet years, when she was the only black woman in a class of 97, when instructors doubted her stamina, when fellow soldiers assumed she'd get soft under pressure, when she had to be twice as good just to be considered average. And now, decades later, after rising through every rank on merit after commanding joint operations across 4 continents, she had been thrown against a police cruiser like a petty criminal because a white man with a badge couldn't fathom her existence. That sting wasn't personal. It was political. It was generational, and it needed to end with her. The next morning, Alana was already dressed in a sleek gray suit, hair tied back medals left behind, not because she wasn't proud of them, but because she didn't need them to command respect. She stepped into the Capitol building through the private defense entrance, escorted by 2 federal marshals, not for her protection, but to signal that what she was about to say mattered. The courtroom was packed. Reporters leaned forward like vultures at the scent of revelation. Activists in the back row held signs that read, "Justice has no rank," while others simply wore shirts with her silhouette and the words, "She stood straight." At the center table, Alana sat, microphone blinking, red camera lights flaring. The chairman of the hearing, Senator Jonathan Marks, cleared his throat. "General Reed," he began, "we appreciate your time. We understand this incident has caused distress. Our goal today is to understand what occurred and what policy changes may be necessary." Alana leaned forward. "Senator," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, lethal. "With all due respect, what occurred was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a sickness you've allowed to fester in silence. And if this body doesn't act now, not just for me, but for every citizen this could have happened to, then this chamber is as complicit as the men who cuffed me." The silence was absolute. Her words echoed across microphones, bounced off marble walls, and carved their way into transcripts that would outlive everyone in that room. "You want a policy change," she continued. "Then stop funding departments that treat skin color as a threat level. Start requiring federal audits of local precincts, mandate body cam footage disclosure, create real consequences, not paid suspensions, and quiet retirements." One senator leaned forward, face tight with political anxiety. "General, some might argue this is an overreaction. 2 officers misjudged a situation. Isn't that being addressed?" Alana stared him down, like she had stared down enemy commanders in bunkers overseas. "I've commanded drone strikes with less margin of error," she said coldly. "I don't accept misjudgment as an excuse when lives are at stake. You shouldn't either." The audience broke into applause before they were silenced by a gavel. Over the next hour, Alana laid bare the patterns of profiling the insidious nature of routine, stops the systemic rot disguised as protocol. She read out names of civilians who hadn't been generals, who had no titles to protect them, who had been bruised, silenced, or worse. And when she finished, she looked into the cameras and said, "I survived because of my rank, but justice shouldn't require a title." Outside, as the media swarmed her, Alana gave no speeches. She walked calmly down the Capitol steps, a quiet storm, in heels and dignity. That night the footage went viral, not just the arrest, not just the hearing, but the stare. The way she looked at that senator, the way she refused to beg, the way she didn't crumble. She became more than a general. She became a symbol, and symbols once born cannot be erased. In a quiet room in Arlington PD's headquarters, officers Mitchell and Daly watched it all unfold from separate rooms, no longer in uniform, no longer smug, no longer untouchable. And as their union rep muttered about pending hearings and media overreach, they realized something too late. They hadn't just cuffed a woman, they had cuffed a movement, and now that movement had a name, Alana Reed, and she was not done speaking. 3 days after her testimony shook the marble pillars of Capitol Hill and reawakened a dormant public conscience, Brigadier General Alana Reed found herself seated in a starkly lit conference room deep within the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. Not as a victim requesting redress, but as a strategist helping design the blueprint for federal reform. Across from her sat the Attorney General himself. Sleeves rolled up, voice taut with urgency, flanked by analysts, civil rights attorneys, and federal investigators, all aware that they were no longer just dealing with a PR crisis or internal misconduct case. This was national combustion waiting for ignition. And Alana Reed was both the spark and the fuse. She had become the fixed point around which Fury Hope policy and reckoning now orbited, not because she sought attention, but because she had forced the nation to look into a mirror it had spent decades turning away from. "We need your insights," the Attorney General said, his voice laced with both admiration and unease. "You've been on the battlefield in more ways than one. Help us write what comes next." And Alana, still composed in her pressed charcoal gray uniform, with only one service medal, pinned not for decoration, but defiance, nodded once before, spreading before them a document she had stayed up drafting until 4:17 a.m. The night before, the Reed proposal, a sweeping policy reform initiative that recommended mandatory quarterly audits of all precincts, receiving federal funding, compulsory racial bias, and constitutional rights training every 6 months. A federal civilian oversight board with subpoena power, and perhaps most controversially, the establishment of a zero-tolerance rule for racial misidentification, leading to detainment, a category vague enough to unsettle every police union leader from Portland to Pensacola. The room grew tense as her voice sliced through the bureaucratic fog, like a field commander issuing orders before a breach. "You want to prevent another incident like mine. You can't fix the floorboards when the foundation is rotted. Burn down what's broken and rebuild it in daylight." And for a moment, no one moved, until finally an older DOJ analyst whispered almost reverently, "My God, she's giving us the blueprint we've needed since Rodney King." And the silence that followed was not from doubt. It was from the collective realization that history had just been handed to them, typed in 12-point font, by a woman they had tried to handcuff into silence. By midday, leaks of the Reed proposal had reached every major newsroom in America. CNN led with General Reed's plan could transform American policing, while Fox News countered with "Military General wants to strip local police of authority," a headline that only served to deepen her legend. Meanwhile, in the streets, something was stirring. Marches began, not just in D.C., but in cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and Oakland, where Black mothers carried signs that read, "She spoke for my son," and veterans in uniform marched silently beside activists. Fists raised no chance, just presence. In classrooms, college students studied her testimony like scripture, dissecting each phrase for rhetorical power. And in barbershops and church basements, her name became shorthand for "We're not afraid anymore." Back in Arlington, the mayor, pressured by overwhelming public outcry, issued an emergency press conference announcing the suspension of the entire Internal Affairs Division, pending review of first in the county's history. Both officers, Mitchell and Daly, had been served with federal subpoenas and were now under investigation for civil rights violations, falsifying stop reports, and unlawful detainment. A trio of charges that, if substantiated, could strip them of pension certifications and freedom. And yet, for Alana, none of this felt like victory. As she sat alone in her kitchen that evening, nursing a cup of black tea and staring out at the silent outline of the Washington Monument, her heart carried not triumph, but weight, the weight of every woman who had been ignored because she didn't wear stars on her shoulder, the weight of every man who had been bruised without the shield of rank, the weight of every child watching the news wondering if dignity was still possible. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her niece, a 14-year-old honors student in Baltimore, who texted simply, "I told my teacher about you today. I said, that's my aunt. She's not just a general, she's justice in a suit." And for the first time in days, Alana smiled not for herself, but for the seed planted for the echo that would outlast her own voice. But the moment didn't last long, because at precisely 10:42 p.m., she received an encrypted alert from military intelligence. The Arlington Police Department's local server had been breached and a document flagged. Suppressed internal incident reports had been decrypted and released onto the dark web, revealing a pattern of racial profiling going back 7 years, with over 3,000 suppressed civilian complaints involving 22 officers, many of whom had been promoted instead of punished. Alana stood slowly, fury and focus converging like storm clouds, and muttered to herself the words she hadn't said since her last combat deployment. Then we go deeper. No more masks, and with that, she opened her secure laptop, activated the emergency investigation matrix she'd once used to hunt war criminals abroad, and turned its lens homeward, for this battlefield was domestic, and this war she now knew was only beginning. As dawn broke over the Potomac and the copper-toned sky spilled light onto the roofs of a city trying to contain its guilt in neatly pressed suits and redacted memos, Brigadier General Alana Reed sat at the helm of a classified investigative interface known as EchoNet, a military-grade intelligence platform she had once used to trace insurgent funding across Eastern Europe, but now reconfigured to sift through the sludge of domestic corruption within her own country's policing systems. The irony was bitter and heavy, the kind of irony only a veteran of 2 wars and 1,000 political betrayals could appreciate. And as lines of decrypted data unraveled across her screen, like veins feeding a diseased heart, Alana saw what she had suspected all along. This wasn't just about Officers Mitchell and Daly, wasn't just about Arlington, wasn't even about her anymore. This was a pattern methodical and sanctioned through silent nods and rubber-stamped paperwork. A quiet machinery of racial targeting, wrapped in procedural jargon and buried beneath bureaucratic indifference. The breach had exposed what no audit ever dared: 7 years of falsified stop reports, body cam footage mysteriously lost at complainants labeled uncooperative, and a digital trail that led directly to the office of Deputy Chief Byron Kessler, a man who as early as 2019 had flagged complaints involving minority civilians as low priority and instructed his subordinates to maintain patrol presence in low-income zones regardless of incident volume. Alana didn't flinch, didn't blink as names of civilians appeared. Darnell, W17 fractured wrist. Monique A33 detained without charges. Elijah R26 tased during a non-compliant ID check. Each file another drop of gasoline spilling onto the floor of a room already lit by fury. By 6:13 a.m., she had compiled a dossier over 400 pages long and sent it through a double encrypted channel to Secretary Anderson marked Tier 1, immediate action required. At 7:04 a.m., Anderson called back breathless and stunned, his voice caught somewhere between reverence and panic. Alana, this is a bomb, to which she replied, then let's detonate it in daylight. Within the hour, the Department of Justice held an emergency press briefing, not in their usual sterile conference room, but on the steps of the Supreme Court, a deliberate symbol chosen by Alana herself to remind the nation that justice wasn't just a slogan, it was a structure, and that structure had cracked. Attorney General Moreno stood at the podium, flanked by Alana's Secretary Anderson and 4 civilian families from Arlington, whose cases had been buried, each of them holding framed photos not of martyrdom, but of survival. We are no longer reacting, Moreno declared, voice steady over the sea of flashing cameras. We are prosecuting, and with that, the DOJ formally announced a multi-agency federal probe into the Arlington Police Department, citing systemic racial abuse, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal civil rights violations. But even as applause rippled through the watching crowd, even as news anchors scrambled to frame the moment, as historic Alana Reed stood still, her face unreadable because she knew that headlines didn't equal healing and investigations didn't guarantee justice. They were just the first tremor before the quake. That afternoon, she met with the families in private, offering not comfort, but truth, because comfort, she believed, had too often been used to silence outrage. I won't promise you justice, she said, hands clasped tightly in her lap, but I will promise you pursuit, and I won't stop, not until this system chokes on every lie it ever buried. The mother of Darnell W. wept quietly, then reached across the table and grasped Alana's hand, her fingers trembling, but strong. "I prayed for someone like you," she whispered, and Alana, for the first time in this entire ordeal, felt the tears sting her own eyes. Not for herself, but for every mother who had waited too long for someone to fight like this. Meanwhile, inside Arlington PD headquarters, the walls were closing in. Deputy Chief Kessler had been placed on immediate administrative leave, a thin euphemism for internal exile, and a swarm of federal investigators now occupied the building, seizing hard drives, reviewing training protocols, interviewing officers whose oaths had long since hollowed into habit. Mitchell and Daly, now formally charged, had been moved to separate holding facilities under protective custody, after credible threats were made against them online, and still public outrage grew. Community organizers flooded the streets with coordinated vigils. Protesters wrapped their arms in mock handcuffs. Churches held interfaith services where pastors read aloud names from the leaked files in trembling righteous voices. And through it all, Alana kept moving, meeting with policymakers, law professors, federal judges, even a group of rising cadets at West Point, where she stood before a lecture hall of stunned young faces and told them plainly, "Respect isn't earned by power, it's earned by restraint. Learn that now, or you'll spend a lifetime unlearning it in shame." Her words echoed beyond the hall, clipped into viral video edits, remixed into protest chants, quoted in Senate subcommittee hearings on policing oversight. Yet through the momentum, the noise, the chants and interviews and legislative drafts, Alana remained grounded by a singular memory. That moment her face met the cold steel hood of a cruiser, not because she resisted, but because she existed. And as she stared out the window of her temporary DOJ office late that evening, the Capitol silhouetted against an indigo sky, she knew this wasn't her final mission. Not yet. A knock came at the door, Secretary Anderson holding a folder with trembling hands, his eyes dark with implications. "It's not just Arlington," he said, laying the file on the desk. Inside were preliminary findings from 5 other precincts: Philadelphia, Tulsa, Baton Rouge, Tempe, St. Louis, each with patterns alarmingly similar, each with language like suspicious driver, verbal non-compliance, vehicle fit description, and a disproportionate number of black and brown civilians, harmed, silenced, erased. Alana didn't look away, didn't pause. She lifted the file, closed it, and said, "Then we don't stop at Arlington. We burn the blueprint wherever it's printed," and with that, part 5 of her journey was no longer about vindication. It had become revolution. By the time the weekend sun cast long golden bars across the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Brigadier General Alana Reed was no longer just a decorated officer or a high-ranking strategist. She had become something larger, more complicated, more dangerous to the establishment. A movement incarnate, one that couldn't be categorized by uniform or party lines. A figure both celebrated and feared. Depending on where the shadow of her reforms fell, her name now surged through the veins of a divided country, on protest banners, in op-eds, in church sermons, in courtroom whispers and police precincts, where lieutenants suddenly reviewed training manuals they hadn't touched in years, hoping to anticipate what was coming next. And what was coming next wasn't subtle, wasn't polite. It was a reckoning with teeth. At precisely 8:00 a.m., on Monday morning, Alana walked into a live-streamed closed-door federal summit titled Operation Recalibrate, a multi-agency task force hastily assembled by the president himself following public demands for national police restructuring and a 12-point memo she had authored outlining necessary legislative overhauls. The summit included senior officials from the DOJ, DHS, FBI, Department of Education, civil rights groups, and military liaisons, many of whom were meeting face-to-face for the first time since Alana's case shattered the illusion of internal accountability. She took her seat at the head of the horseshoe table, refusing to flinch as the room tensed in her presence because beneath her tailored blazer was the same spine that had stood unbroken in war zones and now held the weight of a nation's unspoken grief. "We're not here to fix Arlington," she began, her voice steady. "We're here to fix the pattern that made Arlington possible. This is not a PR initiative. This is a structural reset." No one spoke, not out of defiance, but because every person in that room understood the stakes. If they moved forward with her vision, hundreds of police departments could lose federal funding. Thousands of officers might face retroactive review, and entire precinct command structures could be dismantled under the microscope of civil litigation and civilian oversight. Alana continued without hesitation, pointing to a screen behind her, where a digital map lit up in red and orange dots, each one representing incidents flagged by EchoNet from the 5 precincts currently under investigation. "These are not isolated misjudgments," she said, the heat in her voice rising. "They are the result of policies designed to exploit the loopholes we allowed to exist. You want to know how many times a badge became a shield for racism? 3,072 times, and that's just from 5 cities. You multiply that nationwide, and what we have isn't a few bad apples. It's an orchard rotting from its roots." Murmurs erupted across the room. A DHS director muttered that her tone was inflammatory. Alana turned to him unflinching. "What's inflammatory is a 17-year-old tased because he wore a hoodie while walking home. What's inflammatory is a mother being told her son fit the description minutes before he's left. Bleeding on the curb. Don't lecture me about tone. You weren't the one with your face shoved against a car while carrying a Pentagon-level security clearance in your pocket." Silence. Across the room, someone whispered, "God damn." And in that moment, the room flipped what had begun. As reluctant cooperation turned to alignment, fear turned into fire, and before the end of the hour, the first official measure was voted on and passed unanimously: a joint federal civilian tribunal system to review misconduct cases previously closed without charges retroactive to the past 10 years. By noon, 3 more cities had come forward requesting voluntary reviews, hoping to avoid being forced into the investigation pipeline. The media caught wind of the summit midway through the day, and while details were scarce, the headlines roared across the country. General Reed forges national police reform. Plan behind closed doors causing both celebration and backlash. Police unions called her militant un-American and a threat to officer morale, while protest leaders began referring to her as the real commander-in-chief of justice. Meanwhile, Alana received a quiet message through an encrypted line. An anonymous whistleblower from within the St. Louis PD requesting a meeting. The message was short. "They're hiding body cam servers in a separate location. Officers were instructed to delete footage. I can give you coordinates." Alana immediately rerouted her afternoon and met the whistleblower, an officer named Kenneth Bryant, in an abandoned garage on the outskirts of Missouri Avenue. He arrived out of uniform hands, holding a flash drive in one palm and a resignation letter in the other. "They told me to erase everything," he said, voice raw, "but I couldn't sleep. Not after what they did to that kid." Alana took the drive, nodding slowly. "You did the right thing. But understand, after today there's no going back." He looked her in the eye and said, "Good. I don't want to go back." That night, as her team decrypted the footage, grainy time-stamped videos of unprovoked violence, mocking laughter, racial slurs muttered under breath, bootsteps approaching innocent civilians in the dark, Alana sat still, her body rigid with the memory of her own humiliation, her wrists remembering the bite of the cuffs, not physically, but spiritually. And she made a decision: this would not just be an investigation. This would be exposure, education, and eradication all at once. She stood and began drafting a new initiative, this time called Project Daylight, which would legally require all precincts to publish anonymized data on every civilian stop, use of force case, and internal complaint within 72 hours of occurrence failure, of which would result in automatic federal review. Her legal team, exhausted but driven, worked through the night, and by morning, the draft had been forwarded to 2 senators and 1 House representative, all of whom had already pledged public support. Her phone lit up with a text from Secretary Anderson D., CPD, just asked for a meeting. "They want to cooperate. You're winning, General." But Alana didn't smile, not because she wasn't proud, but because she knew this wasn't about winning. It was about not losing anymore, not losing lives, not losing truth, not losing the chance to tear out what was broken and build something worthy of the word justice. And as the morning sun burned across her window, painting her room in amber and fire, she whispered to herself, not as a soldier, but as a citizen finally refusing to look away, "We won't be cuffed into silence ever again." By midweek, as spring rain whispered against the glass facade of the Capitol, and the nation stood riveted in a suspended state between outrage and revelation, Brigadier General Alana Reed became the focal point of a political firestorm too massive to contain. Cable news hosts across the ideological spectrum debated her legacy in real time, some calling her a patriot with unshakable integrity, others accusing her of militarizing civilian oversight, while law enforcement unions scrambled to mobilize resistance under banners of officer dignity and chain-of-command violations. But none of that noise mattered to Alana as she stood before a packed congressional hearing room. Her back straight, her eyes calm, her words like chiseled steel, because this time she wasn't testifying to defend herself. She was testifying to dismantle an illusion. This is not about rogue officers, she told the Judiciary Committee, her voice steady, echoing through the microphones and into homes across the country. This is about a system that incentivizes racial targeting, conceals its own failures and rewards silence over accountability. You've asked why people are angry. The answer is simple: because they're tired of being told justice exists while watching it get buried. A senator from Georgia, flustered, interrupted her mid-sentence, accusing her of vilifying an entire profession. Alana didn't blink. "I served 28 years in the U.S. military," she replied coldly. "And if one of my soldiers had unlawfully restrained a civilian, lied in a report, or ignored protocol, they wouldn't just be reprimanded, they'd be court-martialed. So, don't talk to me about professions. Talk to me about accountability." The room exploded into murmurs, some in awe, others in outrage. But Alana stood untouched, unshaken, a woman who had faced down warlords and white-collar cowards alike, and seen more loyalty in a foxhole than in half the agencies sitting before her. Later that night, as she walked through the marble rotunda of the Capitol on her way to a closed-door intelligence briefing, a man in a cheap Navy suit approached her, flanked by two aides, Representative Brock Lambert of Texas, a staunch defender of blue lives and a vocal critic of her investigations. "General," he said, his voice syrupy with false civility, "I'd advise you to tread lightly. You're making enemies where you once had allies." Alana stared at him without smiling. Then perhaps they were never allies to begin with. Lambert's smirk faltered. "There's talk of pushing a bill to limit federal jurisdiction over local police. Your campaign could fall apart overnight." "Then I suggest you draft it quickly," she said, brushing past him. "Because every hour you wait, another city joins me." And she wasn't exaggerating, since the public unveiling of Project Daylight over 17 municipalities had voluntarily submitted to independent review. 3 state governors had pledged budget reallocations to community oversight boards, and more than 60,000 citizens had signed petitions demanding similar audits in their districts. Meanwhile, in her private inbox, messages flooded in, some of support, others filled with venom and death threats so vile her security team tripled their surveillance protocols. One email stood out, though, marked urgent. It contained a leaked memo from within the Fraternal Order of Police's national chapter, explicitly naming her as a strategic adversary and outlining methods to discredit her testimony, including targeted FOIA requests into her military record and an aggressive PR campaign labeling her as unstable due to combat trauma. The message, intended only for internal distribution, had been forwarded to her by an anonymous source with the subject line, "They're coming, be ready." She forwarded it directly to Secretary Anderson in the Department of Defense's Internal Security Division, then sat quietly in her office for nearly an hour. No tears, no fear, just the slow and sobering realization that even truth came at a cost. She had spent years in combat zones defending a nation she now had to defend herself against. And yet she felt no hesitation, only a deeper burn, a clarity honed like a blade. Later that week, she made a rare appearance on national television. The State Hour, hosted by a notoriously aggressive anchor known for steamrolling guests into sound bites. But when Alana appeared, she didn't just hold her own. She shifted the axis of the conversation entirely. "Are you anti-police, General?" the host demanded. Within the first minute, Alana leaned forward. "No," she replied coolly. "I'm anti-corruption, anti-abuse, anti-fabricated reports and body cams that go missing when the suspect is black. If you think that's anti-police, then perhaps the problem is what you're defending, not what I'm exposing." The studio fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "And do you think your military background makes you morally superior to civil law enforcement?" He pushed. Alana gave a small, wry smile. "No, but it does mean I understand what rules of engagement look like. And I can tell you this, cuffing a woman without provocation, shoving her onto a car hood and laughing about it while refusing to check her ID, that's not enforcement, that's cowardice. The next morning, the clip had racked up 22 million views across platforms with hashtags like Reed Unfiltered and, as she called, It Cowardice trending worldwide. Celebrities, veterans, civil rights leaders, even international diplomats began quoting her, while police reform opponents doubled down, claiming she was inciting anti-law enforcement sentiment. But amidst the noise, something unmistakable was shifting. People who had once stayed quiet were now speaking. Survivors were coming forward. Precincts were being forced to justify their practices not in closed rooms, but under the hot, unrelenting spotlight of public inquiry. And at the center of it all was Alana. Still unbent, still deliberate, still walking every corridor of power, like it belonged to her, because it did not through inheritance or political favor, but through earned integrity. And yet, as she returned home that night, escorted by 2 plainclothes federal agents, her mind was not on the noise, but on a folder sitting unopened on her desk, one sent by a former Pentagon aide she hadn't spoken to in 6 years, containing information that would drag this fight into even deeper waters. Connections between federal funding incentives and local arrest quotas, a hidden mechanism that rewarded high-volume stops with military-grade surplus equipment. If what she read next was true, then the rot wasn't just local, it was strategic budgeted, and endorsed by officials across 2 administrations. She opened the file slowly, breath held, and as the first pages came into view, her pulse changed, not from fear, but from recognition. This war wasn't just hers to fight. It was everyone's, and if she didn't keep going, who would? She turned to the window, the Washington skyline glowing faint behind the rain, and whispered again to no one and to everyone, "Let them come, I won't back down." The following morning began not with sunlight, but with thunder. Thick gray storm clouds brooded over Washington, as if nature itself was bracing for what Brigadier General Alana Reed was about to unleash. She stood alone inside a secure briefing room at the Eisenhower Executive Office building, staring at a projection screen that displayed a map not of foreign battlegrounds, but of America's police funding ecosystem, an intricate web of federal grants, surplus military transfers, and performance-based incentives tied not to public safety outcomes but to arrest quotas, traffic stop metrics, and discretionary asset forfeiture. What chilled her wasn't the complexity of the system. It was its intentionality, the way it had been designed to reward volume over virtue, to treat community engagement as a PR tactic rather than policy, to flood local departments with equipment meant for war zones while training barely skimmed constitutional protocol. She had seen this before. In destabilized regions where corrupt governments masked oppression as efficiency, but never had she expected to see that blueprint replicated in the country, whose flag she saluted every morning for 3 decades. The documents in front of her weren't speculative. They were signed, time-stamped, budgeted, and executed under initiatives that spanned both Democratic and Republican administrations. One slide showed a directive issued in 2012 by a now-retired federal procurement officer. Departments showing consistent field activity and aggressive presence should be prioritized for MRAP distribution. Aggressive presence, field activity, code words that mask predatory policing in the language of logistics. Alana's jaw clenched. She looked across the table at Secretary Anderson, whose face had grown pale as she presented the findings. "Tell me," she said quietly, "how many departments knew this?" Anderson ran a hand down his face. All of them, or at least the ones that requested the equipment. And how many civilians were harmed because of policies built on these incentives? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was its own confession. "Then it's not just bad policing," she said, her voice sharpening. "It's federally engineered harm." Anderson swallowed hard. "You're saying this is what A sanctioned exploitation model?" "I'm saying," she replied, turning off the projector, "that we've militarized law enforcement through financial addiction. And now we're shocked that it behaves like a foreign occupying force." Her words hung in the air like smoke after a detonation. No one moved, because in that moment, the line between foreign and domestic warfare had blurred, and Alana Reed had just drawn a red circle around the Pentagon's shadow on the streets of American cities. That afternoon, she returned to her DOJ war room and convened her cross-agency team for a classified emergency session. "We don't just have a pattern," she told them. "We have a supply chain, and I want it dismantled. She began drafting the Reed Amendment, a federal legislative package designed to immediately halt all transfers of military equipment to local police departments, revoke funding from precincts with disproportional racial stop data, and reroute those funds into community-led safety initiatives and civil rights-based training programs. She sent the draft to 3 senators, 1 Democrat, 1 independent, and 1 Republican military veteran, each of whom had seen the footage from Arlington, each of whom now owed the truth, a voice louder than politics. By the end of the day, the document had sparked uproar across Capitol Hill, with political commentators calling it the most aggressive civilian oversight proposal in U.S. history. Protesters flooded outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "End the war on us," while counter-protesters clashed with chants of, "Don't disarm our defenders," forcing National Guard units to quietly monitor the perimeter. Not for the first time, Alana noticed, but perhaps for the most ironic. Inside her own home, federal agents rotated shifts to ensure her safety, her front porch now framed by floodlights and surveillance equipment. Yet she carried on without hesitation, because fear had become irrelevant the moment she realized she could no longer distinguish between combat zones and neighborhood blocks. That night, while reviewing satellite logs and budget spreadsheets that had once been classified beyond her own clearance level, she found something buried in a footnote, an internal directive code, OP Radius 547A, linked to a nationwide operation in which urban precincts were incentivized to perform nightly visibility sweeps in predominantly minority neighborhoods during election years. The implications hit her like artillery. This wasn't about safety, it was about control, about demographic suppression disguised as crime prevention, and the idea that votes movement and trust had been undermined not by foreign hackers, but by local officers wielding federal dollars as weapons. It ignited something primal in her. At 11:19 p.m., she made a call to the Office of Government Ethics and requested a formal federal hearing to present these findings not in private chambers, but publicly under oath with media access. "Ma'am, that will provoke a national response," the deputy director warned. "Good," she replied. "It should." In the early hours of the next morning, headlines began to leak. Reed to expose nationwide police federal funding conspiracy. Social media ignited. Reed Amendment trending in 47 states. And across America, precinct chiefs held emergency meetings, state governors called press conferences, while ordinary citizens stared at their screens, wondering how long the system had been tilting beneath their feet, without a single person daring to say, "It's crooked." And there in the epicenter of the storm stood Alana, unmoving, unafraid, her eyes not on the danger, but on the duty. A duty no longer defined by the uniform on her shoulders, but by the lives she now spoke for. The mother shoved to the ground during a traffic stop. The boy tosed for being too nervous. The man jailed for questioning a badge without knowing that badge had never faced accountability. And as she stood before her window once more, Washington glowing in 1,000 uneasy lights behind her, she whispered the same vow she'd made the day her face hit the hood of that cruiser. A vow now etched in every policy draft and televised speech. "I will drag this system into the daylight, even if I have to rip it apart with my own hands." By the time Friday morning shattered the uneasy calm that had held Washington hostage all week, the entire nation seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if every courthouse, coffee shop, and classroom had paused mid-breath to ask the same question. What will she reveal today? And at precisely 9:00 a.m., Brigadier General Alana Reed stepped through the marble corridors of the Senate's Hart Building, her heels clicking like a metronome of defiance, her navy suit crisp, her expression unreadable. Ahead of her, room SH-216 was already packed beyond legal capacity. Fire marshals unable to turn away the flood of observers, activists, law students, journalists, and off-duty officers in plainclothes. Each one gripping not just a seat, but a stake in whatever was about to happen. She passed the press pool, no nods, no smiles, just the quiet dignity of a woman who knew her words would echo far beyond the walls that tried to contain them. The hearing had been scheduled under intense political pressure and procedural resistance nearly derailed by last-minute attempts from multiple senators to delay or move it to closed session. But the public backlash had been too swift, too fierce. And now the chamber was live-streamed to over 4 million viewers before the first word was spoken. When Alana took her seat, there was no dramatic flourish, only silence heavy and pregnant with truth. The chair of the Oversight Committee cleared his throat, then gestured for her to begin. And when she did, her voice was not loud, but it carried like a drumbeat through the bones of every person in the room for over a decade. Federal incentives have quietly dictated the policing strategies of our local departments, not for public safety, not for constitutional adherence, but for performance metrics engineered to reward arrests over equity suppression, over service, and fear over trust. This wasn't negligence, it was design. She paused, no sound, not even typing. Only the high-pitched whir of live broadcast equipment and the sound of reckoning catching up to a system that had thought itself immune. I am here, she continued, not as a general, not as a political appointee, but as a citizen who has lived the hypocrisy. I was detained unlawfully by men whose department received over $6 million in federal military surplus equipment in exchange for increasing their stop rates in minority neighborhoods. Equipment funded by your budgets, your signatures, and your silence. She slid a flash drive across the table. Contained here are over 2,800 pages of communications budgets and directives, proving that local precincts were instructed to manipulate data over police impoverished communities and coordinate their visibility with election cycles to influence voter turnout. Audible gasps rippled through the gallery. The chairman tried to interject, but Alana raised her hand not in aggression, but command, and continued. These were not accidents. They were orchestrations, funded by us, by you. One senator from Louisiana attempted to pivot, suggesting perhaps her interpretation was colored by trauma. Alana turned to him slowly, her stare cutting through generations of patronization. Senator, if you believe that my trauma invalidates my testimony, perhaps we should revisit every piece of legislation passed after 9/11, unless you're suggesting we only honor trauma when it's politically convenient. The room froze. The senator leaned back silent. Across the chamber, one of the youngest committee members whispered barely audible, "Damn." She pressed forward, revealing chart after chart, body cam deletion requests that spiked during fiscal review periods, racial stop disparities rising in tandem with federal equipment grants, internal emails, where chiefs of police boasted about hitting their numbers to unlock armored vehicles. And finally, a single page with redacted lines, an email from a White House defense advisor years prior, suggesting that urban precinct activation could be leveraged as a behavioral deterrent in low turnout districts. This, Alana said, pointing to the screen, is not just policing. This is voter suppression, civil rights violation, and military occupation under domestic camouflage. Cameras captured every moment, live-stream chats flooded with messages. She's dropping bombs. This is the real patriotism. I'm crying in my office right now. And across the country, local lawmakers canceled lunch meetings to watch police chiefs huddled in private strategy sessions, and parents pulled their children into living rooms to explain why this day mattered more than any textbook could ever teach. At the end of her 2-hour statement, Alana stood not for dramatic exit, but because her job was not to convince, it was to confront. I am not here to burn down institutions, she said, her voice rising only slightly, but I will no longer protect those that hide behind the ashes of the ones they've already destroyed. I'm done asking. I'm done waiting. We start now. And with that, she walked out not to applause, but to reverent silence so profound it felt sacred. In the hours that followed, fallout erupted. The president called for an emergency meeting with DOJ and Homeland Security. Multiple senators faced ethics complaints for prior knowledge of the program funding mechanisms. Whistleblowers from 2 additional cities came forward voluntarily, and the Pentagon itself issued a rare statement of support, acknowledging that the misuse of military-grade resources by domestic law enforcement violates the intent of our surplus transfer programs and undermines public trust. Meanwhile, on the street outside the Hart Building, a crowd of over 12,000 had gathered by sunset, holding candle signs and phones raised to the sky, not in protest, but in purpose. And from the rooftop, Alana watched them, not with pride, but with resolve, her hands resting calmly on the rail, her eyes reflecting every flame lit below, because she knew this wasn't the peak, this was the pressure building, this wasn't the resolution, this was the rupture. And if the system thought it could survive this storm by spinning platitudes and performing repentance, it hadn't learned what every soldier already knew, that sometimes peace is not the absence of conflict, It is the destruction of the lie that pretends to be order. And Alana Reed had made her decision. She would not rest until that lie and everything built upon it came crashing down in daylight. 3 days after her historic testimony shook the nation and redefined the battle lines between authority and accountability, Brigadier General Alana Reed stood alone at the center of Constitution Plaza, facing the largest civilian-led assembly ever recorded on federal grounds. A sea of nearly 100,000 people stretching from the Capitol steps to the edges of the mall, holding banners, candles, children and each other, many in silence, some in tears, all drawn by something they could not name but felt an awakening, a rupture, a calling. Behind her, on a temporary stage backed by reinforced scaffolding and armed federal security, politicians, civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and survivors gathered not as speakers but as witnesses. Because this day, this moment, this reckoning belonged to one woman, one voice. One unbreakable spine, forged in combat and consecrated in truth. The storm clouds had passed, but the air still trembled with tension, the kind that doesn't precede rain, but revolution. And when Alana finally stepped to the podium, no notes, no teleprompter, just her and a microphone. The crowd grew so quiet it seemed like the entire city had inhaled and was too afraid to exhale. She looked out at the faces, mothers who had buried sons, veterans who had turned against the silence of their command. Police officers who had torn badges from their chests and protest students too young to vote, but old enough to bleed. And she began, not with anger, but with memory. "I was not born to lead this war," she said, her voice low, but unwavering. "I did not ask for this battlefield. I did not plan to become the face of a truth. This country has long buried beneath uniforms and policies and unspoken quotas. But I was shoved into it face first by a pair of hands that didn't see a citizen, didn't see a general, didn't even see a woman, just saw black, just saw threat." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not outrage but recognition. "When I stood before Congress," she continued, "I did not speak for myself. I spoke for every man who was told to stop resisting when he was only breathing, every woman asked to explain her pain with her hands behind her back, every child who was told the police were here to protect them until they ran." Her eyes scanned the horizon. "They told me I was destabilizing morale. But what kind of morale do we want? One built on silence, one propped up by fear. I was trained to defend this country from enemies, foreign and domestic. But what happens when the domestic enemy is a system too proud to admit it's broken?" Applause thundered, then died just as quickly. They didn't come for performance, they came for reckoning. Today Alana declared, "I am invoking Article 1 of the Reed Amendment, a clause ratified less than 48 hours ago by emergency congressional vote, which grants the Department of Justice temporary authority to suspend all federal equipment transfers and funding pipelines to precincts under investigation for constitutional violations." The words hit like detonation. Cheers erupted, not wild, but volcanic. Effective immediately, she continued, over 400 departments across the nation are frozen from accessing military surplus, pending independent civilian review, and any officer found falsifying stops, targeting by race, or tampering with footage will be permanently barred from future service federally and locally. Gasps turned to tears. Across the plaza, people dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in relief, as if the weight they had carried in their lungs for years had finally been exhaled. But Alana wasn't finished. "This is not a purge. This is a rebirth," she said. "We will not replace one form of control with another. We will build public safety, not policing as we knew it, but community accountability. Trauma, informed response, transparent justice, and the return of dignity to every sidewalk in this country." Reporters scrambled to push updates. Mayors in dozens of cities were served notices within minutes. The stock of weapons contractors tied to law enforcement tanked by nightfall. And still Alana stood there, not triumphant, but steady, as if holding up the sky so it didn't crush those still healing beneath it. That night, as the crowd dispersed like a slow-moving tide, leaving behind candles and chants and chalk-written names of the fallen, Alana walked quietly to the edge of the reflecting pool and sat down alone, her reflection meeting her in the water, not as a soldier or symbol, but as a woman who had dared to speak against the empire of silence. She didn't cry, she didn't collapse, she simply breathed, slow-grounded human. Behind her, the Lincoln Memorial stood tall, illuminated and unmoving. Before her, The Capitol shimmered beneath floodlights, no longer the sole cathedral of power, but now just another place where truth had been forced to kneel, and somewhere in between, in that thin space between past harm and future hope, Brigadier General Alana Reed had carved a new America, one built not on fear, but on reckoning. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the war was no longer hers alone to fight, but everyone's to finish. Brigadier General Alana Reed didn't just defend a nation, she challenged it. She stood against a system built to silence people like her, and with truth as her only weapon, she forced it to kneel. From a street in Arlington to the steps of Congress, her fight became more than personal. It became national. But her story isn't about one woman, it's about all of us, about what we accept, what we protect, and what we're finally ready to change. If her courage moved, you don't let it stop here. Share her story, speak her name, and ask yourself, when it's your turn to stand against injustice, will you